Hello and welcome to Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. Israel-Palestine, when will it ever end? My name is Peter Larson, and I'm the chair of a small NGO called Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. This is the first in a series of 6 lectures delivered at Carleton University in the spring of 2017. This first lecture is a general introduction to the geography and the sociology and the history of the region, and it includes a discussion of the 2 narratives, the story of Israel as seen by Israeli Jews and the story of the Palestinians. And these narratives are sometimes in conflict. The second lecture is called, Who are the Palestinians? Why are they unhappy and what do they want? And it introduces the Palestinians as a people, including their history and their current situation. The third lecture is called The History of Anti-Semitism in Western Europe, the rise of modern Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. And this lecture is special because I have invited a special guest speaker, a Canadian Zionist named Richard Marceau, who will make the presentation. The fourth lecture is called What Does It Mean to Be a Jewish State? It focuses on trying to understand Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and particularly the implications for its non-Jewish citizens. The fifth lecture is about the Palestinian refugees. Over half of the Palestinian population are refugees, and for them the right of return is the most important issue. But for Israeli Jews, it's the most threatening issue, because if they were to return, it would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish state. The last lecture is called Solutions, Canadian Policy, and Conclusions. And it's a wrap-up lecture in which I discuss the various solutions on offer and the Canadian policy towards it. The 6 lectures are independent of one another. You can watch them in any order. It's not necessary to see them in order. To learn more about Canada Talks Israel-Palestine, please visit our website at www.canadatalksisraelpalestine.ca or visit our Facebook page of the same name. If you'd like to contact me with suggestions about the series, please write me at chair.ctip@gmail.com. Thanks very much and happy listening. For today, introduction. That's what we're just finishing up right now. What I want to now do is just do a little bit of reflection on what do I think today. So what I'd like to do is get a show of hands on these questions. This is not a vote. This is not a. I'm just trying to get a sense, first of all, of you, and also that you can get a sense of you. Sort of where are people today on this issue? And you may strongly agree, strongly disagree, or you don't really have an opinion on the topic, okay? So let's just start off with the first one. First question is, or statement, is that the only long-term solution to the conflict is to have 2 equal states living side by side in security. Who strongly agrees with that position? Okay, who strongly disagrees with it? A couple disagree, and who sort of in the middle, don't really know. Okay, all right, okay. So, okay. The second statement here is Israel is a democracy, and Arabs and Jews have equal rights, although admitting that they maybe aren't applied perfectly, as Canada doesn't apply equal rights perfectly. Who would strongly agree with that statement? Yes, okay, maybe 10%. Who would strongly disagree with it? About the same number. And who doesn't know? Okay, so the majority are undeclared on that. That's okay. The next question. Israel is an apartheid state. I'm sure you've heard this said before. Who agrees with that? Okay, yeah. Who disagrees with that? Okay, and who is from Kansas on this? Okay, so most people don't know. This small number of people agree, a couple people disagree. Okay. Most people in Israel-Palestine want peace. The main problem is that the religious extremists on both sides make that impossible. How many people think that's the case? Okay, better than half. How many people disagree with that strongly? Small number disagree with it. How many don't know? How many abstain? Okay, so really, this is a proposition that most people seem to subscribe to. The main problem in Israel is the proportional representation system, in which gives too much power to the extreme right-wing people. How many people think that's really true? Small number think it's true. How many people think it's not true? About the same number, and I take it in the middle, so the rest of you is in the middle on that. Okay, all right. If the Palestinians had had better leadership, starting with Arafat, this could have been solved long ago. How many people agree with that? A couple. How many people disagree with that? Lots of people. Okay, and neutralists? How many Canadians here? Okay. The Palestinian refugees, they got to get over it, right? There's no way that Israel will ever accept 5 million refugees to return, which would make the Jews a minority in Israel. And so the Palestinian refugees, like Russian or Polish or other refugees, just have to suck it up and start making a new life. How many agree with that proposition? Small, 10% maybe. Okay. How many strongly disagree with it? About the same number. Lots of Canadians, I see. Okay, all right, that's okay. I mean, hopefully you will have some more grounds on which to, for those of you who didn't know which way you think, hopefully at the end of the course you'll have some more grounds on which to figure out what you think. Okay. Israel used excessive force against Hamas. We're thinking about Gaza here, right? 2015, the Gaza. But it has a right and an obligation to defend itself against rocket attacks from Gaza. As long as Hamas refused to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, Israel has the right to defend itself. How many people agree with that proposition? Anybody disagree with that proposition? 1, 2 people. Okay. But everybody else seemed to be very broad agreement with that proposition. The key to the problem is the occupation of Palestinian lands in 1967. If Israel were to give up the occupied territories, as Secretary Kerry was suggesting, or as the UN Security Council resolution proposed, that would be the basis for a peace settlement. How many people agree with that proposition? Come on, either agree or don't agree. Now, this is a semi-agree here. So, okay, disagree. Split. Okay, all right. It's basically a hopeless situation, right? Arabs and Jews have hated each other for millennia, and there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe it's going to get better anytime soon. How many people agree with that proposition? Okay, more than half, maybe 2/3. Okay. What I'm going to do today, I told you this, I'm going to talk about what do I think. We're going to talk about basic geography. We're going to talk about terminology. And then we're going to talk about the two narratives. There's an Israeli or Jewish or Zionist narrative, and there is a Palestinian narrative. And then I'll do a bit of review of resources. Let me just talk about geography. The Israel-Palestine area is unique. It has a number of unique characteristics that all feed into this very difficult conflict. One of them comes from just basic geology. It is the passageway in which humans came out of Africa into Europe and into Asia. It is also the north-south flyway for birds that are migrating. Most of them come this way. In fact, right in the middle here, there is the Hula Valley, which is now has the Stephen J. Harper Bird Sanctuary in the Hula Valley. Birds fly from Africa, migrate from Africa up north. It is at the conjuncture of 3 great historical empires. Turkey, which in various configurations with the Ottoman Empire, the Seljuk Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Egypt, the Egyptians and the pharaohs and so on. And Persia. For each one of those empires, this was a strategic location. They fought over it forever and fought. When Iran is supporting Hamas, or Turkey is supporting this, or the Americans, for that matter, are supporting Israel, this is all part of a several thousand-year-old historical pattern of outside entities playing a role in this area. So the fight between Israel and Palestine is not just a unique, circumscribed local event. It fits into a broad historical pattern. It's also at the location of trade routes from south to north, but also trade routes east to west. Israeli archaeologists have found excavations of Philistine sites here near the coast, 3,000 years old, that have goods from Sri Lanka. There have been trade, the silk routes, the caravans from China and Asia came through this area here. So it has been an area that's at the crux or the fault line. In fact, it is also a geological fault line, just as, in addition. And as a result, it has been through time invaded by outside forces forever. Invaded by the Seljuks, the Ottomans, the Mongols, the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Pharaohs, the Romans, the Crusaders. Each of these outside powers has come in for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years and left traces in the area. Traces of culture, but also traces, genetic traces. You can see Palestinians with blonde hair, blue eyes, or red hair. The Normans were there, the Crusaders were there, and so on and so forth. So there's a mixing there and a tension. And I have a short little 3-minute video that kind of summarizes this. I think it's cute, and I hope you enjoy it. So that's just a little bit of, it's interesting, isn't it? It is a fascinating, complicated area which has been contested for thousands of years. Here's a look at geography from a slightly different perspective. Now we're looking narrowly at the Israel-Palestine area, just from its basic topography. This here, this area here is what was called Mandate Palestine. The borders for Palestine were created by the British in 1922. But that's what's called Mandate Palestine. Today, this is called Israel. This part here, here's Israel. This is the West Bank here, this area here. And that's the Gaza Strip there. It's pretty basic for most people, but I'm just reviewing what we are. This is Egypt here. This is Jordan here. Syria here. And Lebanon up at the top. As I say, this is the West Bank, and this is Gaza. And you can see, maybe looking at the topographical map, usually the maps we see are quite planar. You don't really have a sense of what the... Jerusalem is at 600 meters. Jerusalem is noticeably cooler than Tel Aviv, for example. And I don't know that this is to be a fact, but I think one of the reasons why Jerusalem is where it is because in the summer it's a lot cooler. Tel Aviv is quite hot, being in the Mediterranean, whereas it's noticeably cooler in Jerusalem. This is the best agricultural areas in what is Israel-Palestine are along the coast. In the Galilee, this is the Galilee up here, where the man from Nazareth came from. And this is the Jordan Valley here. Now, I didn't know until I went there why that's called the West Bank. And it's called the West Bank because it is the West Bank of the Jordan River. Right? The Jordan River flows from the Sea of Galilee here down into the Dead Sea here. Sea of Galilee is already 200 meters below sea level. And the Dead Sea is like 600 meters below sea level, so it's flowing down here. So that's the topography. So here's the Mediterranean. Tel Aviv is down here. Jerusalem is up at the top, down there. Okay. These are basic facts that are important because, amongst other things, all the best agricultural area is here. Right? This is not a very good agricultural area. It tends to be high, and actually it's dry. More rain falls in Ramallah than in London, England. So it's not dry in that sense. But the rain is concentrated in 3 or 4 months a year, December, January, maybe the end of November, February, and so on. And it's also a limestone formation, so you have to capture the water. If you don't capture the water, you can't have. So most of the Palestinian cities here in this area are in valleys, like Hebron, Nablus, Jenin. They're all in the valleys where the water is available. This is the geography of the West Bank. This is the map of the West. This is the United Nations map of the West Bank. This is this area here, this kidney-shaped area here, right? By the way, just sort of for reference, we're talking about the West Bank is 3 times the size of Ottawa. 2.4 million people. It's 3 times the size of Ottawa. Now, Ottawa's a big, right? I mean, it's got lots of area in it. But that gives you a sense. We're talking about a pretty small area here. We're talking about a 2-state solution. You're talking about one of the states being a little bit bigger than Ottawa, right? That's these different colors. So here's Jerusalem. These different colors show. This is the area. You may have heard that within the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has some control. The Oslo Accord divided the West Bank into 3 zones, A, B, and C. And Zone A is the area where the Palestinian Authority has complete control, although complete still means subservient to the Israeli military. And area C, Israel has complete control. They control the zoning, for example, or do all the kinds of normal policing administrative operations. So this area, these light areas here, are the area that the Palestinian Authority has control. And that's where, when people talk about it being, what's the word? In South Africa, they use the word for the, but that, Bandustans. But when people talk about that's the phenomenon they're referring to. And so for Palestinians to go from Ramallah to Safed or go to Nablus, they have to pass through roads that are under control of the Israeli military. So that's the situation. Yeah.
So you said 3 zones. What's the?
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So there is an intermediate zone. I actually stand corrected. So this is area. The light color is areas A and B. So there's one area which the Palestinian Authority controls, another that the Israelis have complete control in, and then there's one where it's joint. So the Palestinians manage civil affairs like housing construction, but the Israelis do the security. And so this is actually areas A and B. Okay, so it includes A, where the Palestinians have control, and B, which is jointly managed. Okay, yeah.
In which area does Jerusalem?
I'm going to come to Jerusalem. That's a very interesting and very appropriate question. Right now. So here is a map of Jerusalem. Now remember, just so you know, we go back to where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is here, right at the end of this little piece that sticks out here. Here. And Jerusalem, at the end of the, up until 1967, was part of the West Bank. And the green line went like this. Now, since then, Israel has expanded, so this has now been defined as Jerusalem. So they've expanded it. And you can see it better on this map here. So this is the old city of Jerusalem. This is where the Western Wall is. This is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. This is where the Via Dolorosa is, the old part of Jerusalem. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of like Quebec City, right? It's just like this little heart that you can walk around. I think it's not more than 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, probably even less so in terms of dimensions. This here, this green line, is actually what was called the 1949 Green Line, the armistice line. And that line was the line that de facto served as Israel's border in this area. So this was West Jerusalem, and then this over here was East Jerusalem. This was Jewish West Jerusalem, and this is Arab East Jerusalem when they talk about dividing the cities. That border meant that all of the old city, including the temple, or the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the temple and so on, was all in the old city, in the Arab part. And of course, for many Jews, this was not tolerable because the temple was part of their religious tradition. And so in 1967, when Israel took over the rest of the West Bank, then all this area became under Israeli control, but this was called occupied, by the international community, occupied Palestinian territory. Now, since then, there have been repeated clashes and so on, and Israel has started to build settlements in the occupied territories. These purple blotches are the settlements. We're talking hundreds, 300,000 people. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people in the settlements. And then after the Intifada, as a security measure, Israel built this separation barrier, or the wall, to defend itself against terrorism. But the red line is the trajectory of the wall. Yeah, well, actually, this map is several years old. There are continual improvements and moving and so on. So I wouldn't say this is exactly right, but this is like 90% right. This map here now. So this is now the fight when Kerry or others say that, okay, we'll have a two-state solution, but we'll use the 67 borders, but with land swaps. This is what they're saying. Okay, well, the notion, although which places are to be given up is never really made clear, but the notion is that some of these settlements, which this Mali Adumim has 100,000 people, and it is it's connected to Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, by settler-only roads. So for most people who live there, it's just a cheaper alternative as a place to live. It's a suburb of Jerusalem, right? And the legal barrier of the green line, you can walk across it. It's just someone has to point it. Oh, there's the green line. So you wouldn't know it if you're not there. The de facto border has become the red line. So everybody living in this side is, well, they're living in Israel, but they're not citizens of Israel, and that's a whole other question.
Peter?
Yeah.
Explain the difference between a settlement and an outpost.
Sure. Maybe. Let's see. I wonder if what. Yeah. So almost all the settlements start off as outposts. So I'll give a typical scenario. Somebody finds a mikvah, or they find some hill on which there is arguably some ancient Jewish connection, hill in the West Bank. Typically religious groups, normal people don't do this, but people who are highly motivated religiously will get some trailers together and go and take over a hill. Say, this hill has this link to this line in the Bible or something like that. And they're illegal outposts because according to Israeli law, they're not allowed to take over Palestinian land in the West Bank. Characteristically, what happens is that the Palestinians don't like that. So they fight back. They throw rocks. They try to attack them. And the settlers call in the IDF to defend them. Because the IDF's role is to protect Israelis from being attacked by, even if the settlers are doing something illegal, they still get the right to protection, which is understandable. And they usually, characteristically, they put a perimeter around of maybe a couple hundred meters, maybe 300 meters around the outpost, saying the Palestinians can't go there. Right? Palestinians, of course, object to that because that's where they take their sheep or their goats or whatever. And so there's fighting about it, and there's police around and so on. And then after 2 years, Israeli law, which is actually inherited from old Ottoman law, is if you don't use your land for 2 years, you lose it. So that law then, that land then becomes forfeit and gets added to the settlement. The settlement now gets more people to come. And at some point, they get enough people that they can start lobbying with the settler party in Israel to legalize the settlement and to connect it to the grid and connect it to water and to get roads built. And that way, an outpost becomes a settlement. Mali Adumim, if you go on the Mali Adumim website, I don't have it here, but if you go on the Mali Adumim website, just Google Mali Adumim. We could do it now if we had the time. They tell the story of Mali Adumim. That's exactly the story they tell. So we were a group of 13 religious families, and we saw that this was important, and we took it on, and little by little we become regularized, and so on. That's their words, not mine. And of course, this is a source of ongoing friction with the Palestinians because they see the land, these outposts growing and becoming regularized and so on. So in Israel's eyes, legally, right now there are illegal outposts and then there are legal settlements. And there's one of the books in the book list I sent you is called Hilltop. And it's about that process. And this particular gang of people on the Hill are very mad at the Israeli government because they're not giving them the right to be regularized, and they think it's all because of Jewish leftists in Tel Aviv who don't understand what life is really like. I mean, it's an interesting book written about this process. Okay. So here's Gaza. So Gaza Strip is this tiny area. This is 15% of the size of Ottawa, just for reference. It's about, so there's 5 kilometers here. So here at the widest, it's about 5 kilometers wide. Here's Egypt down here, and Israel here. The only access points to Gaza today for people are at the Eretz crossing, where I went last year, or at the Rafah crossing here into Egypt. So this depends a lot on the vagaries of Egyptian politics. Right now, there's basically nobody. These are where the tunnels were, where they were bringing in all kinds of stuff through here. Okay. Gaza is the most important thing about Gaza, and we'll talk about it later, is that most of the people in Gaza are not from Gaza. Most people in Gaza are refugees. They or their families were expelled from Israel in 1948. So about 75 or 80% of the people, of the 1.8 million people living in Gaza are refugees. Yeah. Then there is the issue of the Palestinian refugees, the geography. So the Palestinians left, and we'll come back to your question about expulsion or running away. They left in 1947, starting in 1947 and going on into 48. About 750,000 of them left, and they ended up, most of them, in camps in the periphery. In Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And there are something like 52 UN camps now. Not all Palestinian refugees are in camps. And in fact, the young man that is going to come on our day 5, his parents fled, ended up going to Saudi Arabia. His father worked as an engineer in Saudi Arabia, and then they eventually moved to Canada. But he's still a refugee in the sense that he has a claim on a property. They know where their property was. And it's like, from his point of view, he has just as much right to get that property back as a Jew who had gold or silver or paintings or whatever confiscated by the Nazis, and there are appropriate processes in place to recover that. There are approximately 5 million Palestinian refugees altogether, and people who would define themselves as Palestinian. Terminology is very important. And in fact, the gentleman here raised the issue. Do people get expelled or they run away? What words to use? Terminology is extremely important. And as I said, Rick Steves dances around that in his video, and you'll find that interesting and instructive. Now, I'll give a couple of examples. If someone frames the issue as the Arab world versus Israel, that's a framing of the issue. That's terminology. And it shows here the enormous Arab world against tiny little Israel. Right? I mean, that's a way of seeing. On the other hand, if you frame it as Israel versus the Palestinians, then who's big and who's small, who's dominant and who's subordinate gets reframed. So when you listen to someone talk about this issue, often it only takes a few words you can figure out what's the frame that they're viewing it in. You've probably all seen this map before. It's no, some people haven't. So, just to refresh you, this is British Mandate Palestine. The Jews from Europe came and bought lots of land in Palestine. Then there were the Troubles, and there was the UN decided to partition Palestine, and here was the partition plan. It was actually to be in three parts. It was to be an Arab part, a Jewish part, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem was to be an international city, recognizing the importance to the three monotheistic religions. But for various reasons that I'll get into later, that didn't work out. And when the dust settled and there was the armistice in 1949, Israel had, as you saw, taken over Jerusalem. Was no longer this international city, and Israel had taken over considerably more land than the UN had originally proposed. It went from 55% to something like 78%, I think, is of the original total. And then today, this is the reflection of those beige parts we had before, which is the area that's under effective Palestinian control. But I'm not going to argue for or against the map. I'm just saying there are different ways to view the issue, and the terminology used is quite important. So let's get into some of the issues here. I'll start with Palestine. What do we mean by Palestine? Well, on all of these words, different people have different ideas, different definitions. Okay, it's a legal fact that this area here, including the West Bank, including that, was part of what was called the Palestinian Mandate. That was the first time that Palestine had borders. So that was the legal definition of Palestine until 1947. Today, there is no legal definition for Palestine. Canada doesn't recognize Palestine. What we recognize is Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, but we don't have a... So for some people, Palestine is the whole thing. When I arrive in Tel Aviv airport, I'm greeted by a Palestinian man who lives in Israel, and what he says to me is, "Welcome to Palestine." Okay? So some people think that the whole thing is Palestine. Some people will think the whole thing is Israel. Right? The whole thing is Israel. If you, here's something you might be interested in. Here is my Avis map. Got Jerusalem, Israel. The driving map, right? This is my map of Israel. Okay? There's no West Bank on it. Right? It's all Israel. For most Israelis today, most Israelis think of the West Bank or the occupied territories kind of in the same way I think that we would think of the Northwest Territories. Like it's different, but it's part of Canada. Right? And as you know, for the people in the Northwest Territories didn't have the vote for a long time. Right? They got the vote, the Aboriginal people got the vote in 1960 in Canada. So what is Israel and what is Palestine is a matter of debate and discussion. And by the way, that's the reason why I framed the course. I said Israel, Palestine. I don't say Israel and Palestine, because if you say Israel and Palestine, then you kind of, so okay, this is Israel and this is Palestine. Well, some people think that, but there are some people who think that it's all Israel, and there are some people who think it's all Palestine. So I don't say Israel and Palestine. I say Israel, Palestine. I don't really care what it's called. I care about human rights. Countries change their names over time. I don't care if it's called the Republic of Jerusalem or whatever. That's not really my issue. Yeah?
What was the provenance of the term Palestine?
The provenance of it?
Yeah, because British Mandate is Palestine was created after the First World War.
Right.
And therefore was very artificial.
Okay, so the question is, where does the word Palestine come from? What we know is that when the Romans conquered it in 50 AD, they called it Palestine. We know that the Philistines lived there, and in fact, the Palestinian, in Arabic, you don't have a P sound. So that when an Arab says Palestine, what they say is Philistine. Philistine is that it's definitely linked to the Philistines that lived there. They're in the Bible. Goliath was a Philistinian. Remember Samson? These are old historical tribal names, but this area of the world has been called Palestine for a long time, but it was never, as you point out, was never a country. It was one, or actually 3 provinces under the Romans. It was several different provinces under the Turks, but the area of the world was called Palestine. And when Britain took it over, then it got defined borders. This is Palestine, this is Jordan, that's Syria, that's Lebanon, so on and so forth. So that dealt with, so a Palestinian then is someone who defines himself as Palestinian. It's a Palestinian culture and language and music and history and so on. So we're talking about terminology, continuing on. What is a Jew? Or Jewish? When I was young, at the time of the Oakville kind of thing, it wasn't nice to call somebody a Jew. That was somehow a pejorative term, right? And as I got into this, I was very hesitant at first to use the word Jew. And as I got to meet more and more Jews, I realized that they use that word quite comfortably with each other. What's wrong? Why would you say Jewish? It's sort of like saying sort of black or something. It's like they're Jews. And they're proud of being Jews, and they should be proud of it. And I have no problem with that. So there are about 12 million Jews in the world, more or less. And about half of them live in Israel, about 6.5 million, something like that. Jews live in Israel. And by the way, there are about the same number of Palestinians in the world. There's about 11 to 12. Wikipedia, if you go to Wikipedia, it says between 11 and 20 million Palestinians. Why the number is so expansive? Well, Palestinian man and woman who moves to Canada, they have kids. Are their kids Palestinian or not? It's sort of, am I Swedish? No, I'm not Swedish. My grandfather would have still said he's Swedish, right? But he's no longer. So it's quite elastic. But there's about 12 million Palestinians living within 150 kilometers of Jerusalem. And in the same area of the world, there's about 6 million Jews. The two-state solution, well, the two-state solution is the notion that somehow the land should be divided between two. What the formula for division should be is, this was the UN formula that didn't work. This is, when they talk about the 67 borders, this is the formula that's currently being applied, although now they're talking about the 67 borders with some changes so that a lot of those settlements around Jerusalem would be incorporated and so on. So that's the two-state solution. The West Bank, I talked about. Zionism, Zionist. Now, if you go on Wikipedia, there are lots of, and talk to Jews, there's lots of different definitions of what Zionism is. But basically, the notion is that Jews have the need and have the right to have a state in this area of the world. It needs to be a Jewish state for their own protection. That's the basic notion of Zionism. West Bank. Now, the Israeli government does not call this the West Bank. It calls it Judea and Samaria. So they refuse to use this, and they don't use the word occupied territories either. They use the word Judea and Samaria, referring back to biblical times. The refugees, I've talked a bit about who the refugees are. Occupation, when we talk about occupation, we're talking about, in 1967, Israel took over all this area here and this area here, Gaza, and holds, that's what the UN refers to as the occupied Palestinian territories. Once again, in Israeli government discourse, they deny the word occupation. The Israeli government uses the word disputed territories. According to the Israeli government, this is not an occupation, it's disputed territory. Okay? So if you see a newspaper article that talks about something happened in the disputed territories, that's where this notion is coming from. We're talking about the same geographical area, it's just the terminology used for it. And in terms of annexation, Israel says now that Israel now talks about East Jerusalem as being annexed. So they say this is now part of Israel. That's the terminology that they use. The UN Security Council has just said, no, that's occupied territories. But there's a difference there in the language. OK, that's it on terminology. So 2 narratives. Now, everybody knows what I mean by a narrative, historical narrative. Like we have a narrative in Canada about what, 150th anniversary, right? Sort of all that. Narrative is sort of the story you tell yourself about your people and your world and so on. Now, I got a question for you. If you know the answer to this question, Don't give me the answer. I just want you to raise your hand if you think you know the answer. Okay? I don't want you to give away the thing. Talking about Canadian history. Do you know the answer to this question? What significant Canadian event, significant event in Canadian history, took place in 1755? Raise your hand if you think you know the answer. You think you know the answer. You think you know the answer. Anybody else? 1755. Okay, what do you think the answer was? Expulsion of the Acadians. Right? Now, this is a story about narratives. I went out when I was in grade 11. I went out with a pretty young girl in Quebec City. And we were talking, and she talked about the expulsion of the Acadians, and I'd never heard of it. And she just about fell on the floor. I was a smart kid. I went to school. I studied history. I'd never heard of it. Never heard of the expulsion. But for her, it was like it happened yesterday. So narratives, for her, it fit into a whole history of what the English had done to the French. Yeah. It fits into Louis Riel. It fits into the Patriote. It fits into everything, right? Montreal. So it's part of the narrative. I'd never heard of it. Now, because for me, going to school in Ontario, it wasn't important. No one said it didn't happen. It just didn't talk about it. So a narrative is a selection of the things that you think are important that inform your history. And I want to talk a little bit about the two narratives. I think this is really important to understand the narratives. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about the Jewish or Zionist or Israeli narratives. Now, actually, even terminology is important. Right? Those are not quite the same things. Okay? But most Jews today believe in a Zionist narrative. It's part of their self-definition as Jews, most Jews. That was not the case 150 years ago. And we're going to, I think Mr. Marceau, I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but when the Zionist Congress took place at the end of the 19th century, most Jews were not Zionist. But in the face of rising anti-Semitism and the unwillingness of the Western powers to accept Jewish immigrants, Zionism seemed like the only answer. And so today, Zionism is the dominant theme. There are very few Jews who are non-Zionist today. The Jewish or Zionist or religious narrative starts, well, I'll say it starts off with Moses and the Exodus. It actually starts before that, as you know, but for purposes of making this course. The escape from Egypt to the Promised Land, the parting of the waters, you know the story. They came to the Promised Land, Israel. They defeated the local groups to create the kingdom of Israel. And they established their temple in Jerusalem. They were in one of these waves. We talked about all the waves of invasions and so on. One of them was the Babylonians conquered Judea, and they took a lot of the Jewish leaders back to Babylon, which is Baghdad. They got to, when the Persians came in and took over the area, beat the Babylonians, the Persians allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. So they returned to Jerusalem. Then there was the sack of Jerusalem by the Romans. The Romans conquered the area. Once again, they had these terrible fights. Rome had all these countries around the world, or nations or peoples around the world that had dominated. And the whole history of Rome is fighting one group, fighting another group, that they're trying to get out of Roman domination. And the Jews led an important revolt, and they were put down. And this is from this picture here, shows the menorah, is from Rome, right? It's on I think it's called the Titus Arch. I think that's what it is. It's an arch in Rome, bringing the loot back from Jerusalem. The Jewish, including presumably the menorah was made out of silver or something like that. And once again, Jews were thrust out in the diaspora around the world. The center of Jewish life, or the Jewish people, then moves to Europe. And in Europe, for thousands of years, more than 1,000 years, They suffer terrible oppression and discrimination. You know, we tend to think, most of us tend to think now of Christianity, when we think of Christianity compared to Islam, for example, we think of Christianity being a turn the other cheek, love your brother, all that kind of stuff. But when you think of the 2,000 years of Christian history, for most of that time, we were not very tolerant. Right? That was the Spanish Inquisition, or the conquest of the Mayas, or even fights between Protestants and Catholics. The religious wars in Germany have killed 30% of the population. So Christianity, by today's standards, we think of as being a loving and generous religion. It's not surprising that people who look at us from the outside don't see it quite that way. Okay? So there was the Jews had a history of oppression in Europe. Of course, if you know about the ghettos in Venice is the most famous, but there's even the little town that I stay in Italy now, in eastern Tuscany. There's a little tiny place of 6 or 7 houses. It's called the ghetto. Is where the Jews were at that point, at some point, and I never explored exactly when that was the case. You know that Jews were expelled from England in 1290. They were expelled from Spain in 1492, from Portugal in 1497. We know that there were, it was not until 1848 that Jews were emancipated in Europe. They were emancipated by Napoleon in France after the French Revolution, but it was a big revolt of 1848 across Europe that led to the emancipation of Jews. Up until then, Jews were limited in what they could do legally in Europe. So 1848, so that's 150 years ago, something like that. Interestingly, when they had these expulsions here from Spain and Portugal and so on, where did the Jews go? Well, they went to the Muslim nations, where there had not been the same history of intolerance. In fact, the Sultan of Turkey said, "Come, bring us your doctors and your lawyers. We want you." So Jews moved all in through the Maghreb. Jews moved to Palestine. There were groups of Jews that have been to Safed, which is a town in northern Israel, where people are direct descendants of Jews that came from Spain in 1492. And then there were the pogroms in Russia, and there was particularly with the end of the empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a convergence around nationalist themes, which left the Jews out, and that the Jews had no place to go, and that led to the rise of Zionism, saying we too, for our own protection, we need to have our own state. We need to be able to protect ourselves. The Zionist leaders looked for patrons. They went to talk to the Tsar of Russia, said, "We would like you to help us establish somewhere." That didn't work. They visited the Kaiser, talked to the Kaiser, the German Kaiser. But the British said, "We will help you create a Jewish homeland in Palestine." And that was written out in a document called the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour was a British cabinet minister who subsequently became Prime Minister of Britain. So the British said, "We will help you create a Jewish homeland in Palestine." That was the start of of migrations of European Jews to Palestine. They call it aliyahs, to make aliyahs, to move to the Holy Land. And of course, there was the Holocaust, and during the Holocaust, nobody would take them. Remember the famous boat, right? The St. Louis, right? Boat of Jewish refugees trying to find. They went to Cuba, they went to the States, they wanted to come to Canada. We wouldn't take them. None is too many, right? Absolutely, none is too many. And so for them, this gave a big impulse to Zionism, saying the only answer for us is to have a state of our own, because we can't count on anybody else. So under British auspices, British named a military governor, European Jews started to move there, and Jews bought land, more and more land. They particularly bought up land brought in modern technology. They started to make land that had formerly been swamps or underutilized. They had to develop it better. And the Arabs resisted. The Arabs did not tolerate this. I'm talking about this is the Israeli Jewish Zionist narrative, right? And that led to more and more fighting. And in the end, it was decided that the only answer was to partition the country. Partition the country. And the partition itself was opposed by the Palestinians and the Arabs and accepted by the Jews. But and then that caused a fight. And that led to the State of Israel being declared. When it was declared, Arab countries attacked. They would not tolerate the creation of a Jewish state in the area. The Palestinians ran away. And by 1949, the armistice created the effective borders. These are the 69 borders that we talked about before. These are the ones that actually were created in 1949 and existed until 67. When they call it the 67 borders, what they mean is the borders that existed until 67, after which time Israel took over the whole shebang. You with me on that? So here are the armistice line here, okay? And the State of Israel is born. Okay, so the armistice created the effective borders, and since then, they say that the PLO would not accept. And it kept on attacking, kept on attacking, kept on attacking. And that, attacking from the outside. So here, I'll go back to here. So this is not quite the right map, but if you think of the West Bank here, the Palestinians kept on attacking, sending guerrillas into Israel to try to, they had this notion of national liberation. And so that forced Israel to take over the West Bank, from which a lot of the attacks were taking place. Right? The Arabs continued to resist. That led to terrorism, suicide bombers, and so on and so forth. And that led Israel to construct the wall to protect itself from the suicide bombers. It led us into a never-ending peace process, and that the Palestinians have shown that they are never willing to accept a Jewish state. And so we have no alternative but to continue to protect ourselves. So that's my resume, more or less, of the Jewish historical narratives. I have a document here that I'll put on my website. It's a bit longer. It explains a bit more. But now, on the other side, we have the Palestinian narrative. Now, they would say, they do say, that this area, there were a lot of different tribes there fighting each other. A lot of different tribes. They're competing for terrain. And the Israelites, or the Hebrews, were one of the tribes. And a lot of the information that we have now about that time comes from the Bible, which they wrote. So it's not surprising that the version is that we were the bad guys and they were the good guys. I mean, that's the... They said that there were repeated conquests in the areas, the Babylonians and the Romans and the Greeks and the Crusaders and so on. And that Palestine has been a crossroads but never been an independent country. This area was called Palestine. And we have been fighting for our independence for forever. They say for 400 years we were under the Ottoman Empire. And we were struggling against the Turks. And Britain came along and said to us, and this is the guy who said it, Lawrence of Arabia, you join with us, fight against the Turks, and we'll give you your independence. So they did. What they know now and didn't know then is that Lord Balfour had already made a different promise to the Jews. It said, we will give this land to you. So the Palestinian narrative is the real source of the problem, is the duplicity of England. So after the First World War, Britain being one of the conquering, the Ottoman Empire being defeated, Britain being one of the dominant powers, they get the United Nations, the League of Nations, to give Britain the mandate for Palestine. They say, the Palestinians are not ready for self-government yet, so we're going to run it. And the first thing the British do is name a Zionist governor, a Zionist military governor of Palestine. And they start to make changes in Palestine to implement the Balfour Declaration. For example, Hebrew is made an official language by the British in 1921. The Jewish agency gets legal accommodation. Britain changes some of the laws. So the old Ottoman laws, for example, said, were sort of semi-feudal laws. If you worked on land for a landlord and the owner changed, your family gets to stay there. You're a peasant, but you're stuck to that land. You have a right to that land. And if there's a new owner, you've got to pay your tribute, olive oil or sheep or whatever, to the new owner. Britain changed the rules, brought in British common law system. The new law says if you buy land, you own it. And you can expel the people who live there. They don't have any right to be there. So the Palestinians find themselves expelled from land, legally, supported by the British military, land that they and their families had worked on for many years. Yeah?
It begs the question, if you buy land, who'd you buy it from?
Okay, well, they bought, I will answer that. It was a semi-feudal country. It was characterized by a lot of large landowners and landholders. So Palestine was a class society. There were feudal landlords and there were peasants. A number of those landlords lived in Beirut or lived in Damascus. And if the Jewish agency comes along and says, we have a lot of money, we'll buy the land from you, they say, fine, take it off. So a lot of the land, very little of the land was taken in the stolen sense. It was taken under the aegis of a legal structure that Britain had changed the rules. From the point of view of the Palestinians, this was totally unfair. It's a bit, what prompted the Riau Rebellion was when the surveyors started to come and lay out the land. Say, well, just a minute, this is our land. What are you doing? So it was a bit similar. Then Britain started to encourage thousands and thousands of European Jews to immigrate. Now, from the point of view of the Palestinians, there had been Jews living in Palestine forever. At the time the British took over, there was like 5% or some small number, but a significant number of the people living there were Jewish. They spoke Arabic. There were Palestinians who were Jewish, there were Palestinians who were Christian, there were Palestinians who were Muslim. These Jews were different. These were European Jews, mostly spoke Yiddish. And so they lived it as a European invasion. Right? This was the perception was that Britain is allowing these Europeans to come in and kick us off our land, and we are being expropriated with no due process. It took the Palestinians a while to understand what was going on, and they had a big revolt in 1936-39. A general strike. The general strike was put down very viciously. Leaders were hanged. People were shot, exiled, imprisoned, and so on. And the British were very good at colonial repression, had a lot of experience in it, totally decapitated the Palestinian ability to resist. This is the Palestinian narrative I'm telling you, right? Then they said at the end of the war, when the Palestinian capacity to resist was limited and Britain was exhausted, the Jews, who were now a significant number, saw their opportunity to create a state and to force the British out. So they turned their forces against Britain. And there were many, many acts of terrorism against the British soldiers. Some of you may remember the bombing of the King George Hotel. This was in Jerusalem. This was the British Army headquarters, bombed by Zionist forces in 1946 or somewhere around there. So Britain gave up, turned it over to the UN, and the UN votes to divide Palestine in two. You saw the map earlier. Now here's a question for you. Two questions. First question, which way did Canada vote? November 1947, which way did Canada vote on the proposition to divide Palestine into two? We voted for it.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we voted for it is what the gentleman said at the back. None is too many. A great number of those European Jews wanted to come to America. We didn't want them. It was more convenient for us to say, go over to a land with no people, for people with no land. It was also driven in part by our remorse over the terrible things that happened in the Holocaust, but a lot of it was not nearly so Don't forget, Charlotte Whitman, remember the big debate about Charlotte Whitman? Canada was a very anti-Semitic country in 1947. We didn't want those Jews here. And it suited us to send them off somewhere else. The day after the UN vote, the Zionist forces started to move to expel Palestinians. And part of the answer to your question is that if you go to Jaffa, which was, by the way, supposed to be part of the new Arab state, Jaffa was to be a cutout because it was the biggest Palestinian city at the time. There is a museum on the beach in Jaffa, and I've been there, and it's called the Etzel Museum, the Museum of the Liberation of Jaffa. And it explains how Menachem Begin led Irgun troops to liberate Jaffa. That is to say, get rid of the Palestinians in Jaffa, even though the UN had said that Jaffa was to be part of the new Palestinian state. There were a number of massacres, and these are written, if you look at Ari Shavit's book, one of the books I proposed there, I think every Israeli historian now agrees there were a certain number of massacres. So did people run away because they were run away at gunpoint, or did they run away because people in Barhaven had all been killed, and they were told that you're next, and so they just said, who knows? The issue for the Palestinians is not really so much. Let's assume that we were chicken shit. That's when we're just scaredy cats. We ran away. Does that mean we can't come back? Because Israel won't allow them to come back. That's the issue. So there were the thousands where I use the word expelled, but you can use whatever they left, and this is what the Palestinians call the Nakba. So the fighting continued until May 1948, when Britain finally packed up and left. The Arab countries then attacked, but they were really feeble and ineffective. And as a result, they were overwhelmed. The ethnic cleansing continued for some time, including some massacres. And the net result was there were 750,000 Palestinian refugees who were in a circle around what was historic Palestine. 1947, there was the armistice, the de facto Israeli borders. The refugees are now in the neighboring countries. The UN declares that they have the right to return, Resolution 194, but doesn't effect it. Israel doesn't allow them to return, and the UN doesn't do anything about it. And then, the same thing we just talked about at the settlements, Israel applies the Ottoman law and says, well, you're out of here, so we're now going to confiscate your property. This is called the absentee property law. So they confiscate the property of the refugees. And the Palestinians who remain in Israel, and about 20% remained in Israel, they remain under Israeli military rule for about 20 years. So then the Palestinians say, outside, we've got to get organized, we've got to retake the country. We started the creation of the PLO to liberate Palestine. And then, so they're organized here, and they're attacking, they're trying to infiltrate. And of course, Israel suppresses them. And then that leads to Israel saying, OK, we're going to take over the whole shebang. And they take over the West Bank and Gaza as well. Subsequently to that, there have been 2 intifadas trying to shake this off. It's been unsuccessful. The Israeli settlers are continually colonizing the West Bank. Here's maps of the settlements in the West Bank. And they say that Israel talks continually about a 2-state solution, but the evidence is that's not what they're interested in. They want to take it over, and they want to get rid of us if they can. So, in summary, the Jewish narrative is we've always been a tiny, persecuted people. We've learned through painful experience that we can't rely on anybody else to protect us. In our hour of darkest need, we were turned away. So we've now returned to our ancestral lands, and we plan to stay there. And all we want is for our neighbors to accept our right to exist as a Jewish state. That's my summary of the Jewish Zionist narrative in a few lines. Palestinian narrative, summarized, is that we've lived in this area for thousands of years. We were of mixed racial origin, mixed religions. And the Western countries helped European Jews establish themselves in Palestine. This is a form of colonialism. Those Jews expelled us from our ancestral lands, and they confiscated our property. And they won't let us go back. And there are now 3 main groups of us Palestinians. There are those who live under occupation. There are those who are refugees who are looking for some kind of resolution. and there are those who still live in Israel. So we want an admission, we Palestinians want an admission that what was done to us was wrong. And we want those wrongs to be righted in some way. So, that's my presentation. Thank you very much. See you next week. Thank you so much.